Hey, this is Gavin Gaddis in for Tom Webster for Sounds Profitable on Wednesday, February 25th, 2026. Two people on a couch. The language used to describe podcast behavior matters, and some of it needs updating. But first, in just over 2 weeks, Evolutions by Podcast Movement kicks off for 3 days at South by Southwest 2026. The event has no extra badge requirement or separate ticket fee, featuring curated panels, networking, happy hours, and live events with special celebrity guests, all in a 400-person venue with a capacity for 350 or more overflow at a neighboring space. South by Southwest badge holders do receive priority access. Pre-registration for the event is live and highly encouraged. As your last reminder, I'm subbing in for Tom Webster, so this is in first person from his perspective. Here we go. Last week, I watched my first podcast on Hulu. Some might quibble with whether or not it was a podcast. I don't really care about that. It called itself a podcast, and that was good enough for me. My wife Tamsin and I sat down to check when Paradise was coming back. We're hooked on it, and I'd just seen Sterling K. Brown starting to promote the new season. We pulled up Hulu, and it wasn't available yet. What was there was the first episode of a companion podcast hosted by Brown's wife, Ryan Michelle Bathay, and featuring Dan Fogelman, who created the show, and James Marsden, who plays the president in all those flashbacks. So we watched it together on the couch with our two greyhounds, who I should note did not require an explanation of what a podcast is. What struck me wasn't the content, though the content was good. It was how natural the whole thing felt. I was interested in Paradise content, and I was served exactly the content I was in the mood for. On the screen, I was already watching in the context where I would have wanted to watch such a thing. Zero friction. I didn't go looking for a podcast. The podcast found me in the right place at the right time on the right screen. I didn't even have to check whether it was available anywhere else. Why would I? Here's the thing, though. At no point in the experience did I listen to anything. I watched a podcast with my wife on a television, and I think the language we use for that matters more than we realize. Not co-listening, co-consumption. In our latest study, we identified a segment of 560 respondents who say they consume podcasts, audio or video, with others most of the time or always. The survey itself asks about consumption, which is the right word, but I've been calling them co-listeners in my own shorthand, and I need to stop doing that. It's a term that carries the medium's audio-first assumptions right into the description of a behavior that is larger than that. We all do this. I'm going to try to stop. Because for most of these people, podcasting is visual. 61% spend more than half of their podcast time watching video. YouTube is the dominant platform. 38% use it as their primary podcast platform. Smart TVs are the third most used primary device at 15%. That's way higher than the broader podcast audience. This makes intuitive sense. If you're consuming a podcast with someone else, you're probably not sharing earbuds. You're in a living room. You're looking at a screen. The shared experience gravitates towards video almost by default. But here's where it gets interesting. When you ask this segment what they expect a podcast to be, the answer doesn't necessarily match their behavior. Primarily or exclusively video, 15%. Either video or audio, 28%. Usually audio only, but maybe video, 38%. And audio only is at 19%. Even in a segment defined by shared screen-based consumption, the mental model of what a podcast is still tilts towards audio. Their behavior has outpaced their definition. They're watching podcasts together on a TV, and they still think of podcasts as something you listen to. The word co-listening makes the same mistake. It describes what the medium used to be, not what these people are actually doing. If you've spent any time in audience research, you know the gap between what people do and what they say they do is where all the interesting stuff lives. The clay is still wet. This segment skews new to podcasting. 45% have been consuming podcasts for less than a year. 17% started in the last 30 days. Compare that to the broader podcast audience, where you see a much heavier tilt toward people who've been at it for 3 years or more. And that newness shows in some telling ways. 67% say they're more likely to try a podcast if a company or brand were involved in making it. 54% say AI-generated voices would make them more likely to keep listening, not less. I know, if you've been in podcasting for a while, those numbers make you twitch. But these aren't the responses of people who've spent years developing strong feelings about what podcasting should be. These are people still forming those things. It also raises a question I keep coming back to. How many of these people come to podcasting through podcasting? And how many came through YouTube and discovered that some of what they were already watching happened to be called a podcast? The entry point matters. It shapes what you expect the format to look like, which format feels like home, and what good sounds like or looks like. How do we create this for audio? You can look at this segment and see a definitional crisis. Is this even podcasting? Or you can see a real and growing audience consuming podcast content together, regularly, on the biggest video platform in the world. I know which question I think is more productive. But here's the curveball, and where I actually want to land. I've spent this whole piece arguing that we should stop calling this co-listening, that the old language limits how we think about the behavior, and I stand by that. But I'd be making a different mistake if I walked away from this data thinking the lesson simply is video wins. Because what makes co-consumption work isn't the screen, it's the frictionlessness, it's the context, and it's the reactivity. Two people experiencing something together and having something to talk about. Look at the genre preferences for this segment. Comedy at 39%, sports at 34%, and true crime at 31%. Those are all reactive genres. Half of the fun is the other person's response. You laugh together, you argue the call together, you say, "Oh my God, it was the neighbor," together. None of that requires a screen. Video just got there first, because a television in a living room is an obvious shared surface, and a pair of earbuds is not. So the question I keep turning over is, what does a two people on a couch moment sound like for audio? What's the audio equivalent of Tamsin and me pulling up Hulu and having a podcast just be there, in the right place, at the right time, requiring zero effort? Is it a smart speaker in the kitchen while two people cook dinner? Is it something playing in the car on a long drive that neither person chose, but both react to? Is it a platform feature that doesn't exist yet? I don't have the answer, but I think it's the right question, because the thing that makes this segment valuable isn't that they're watching, it's that they're sharing. And if we can build that kind of frictionless, contextual, shared discovery for audio, the clay is still wet enough to shape it. The Greyhounds, for what it's worth, would prefer audio. Less to look at, more napping. And for those of you out in audio land, hi, Gavin Gaddis here. For those of you in audio land, you should check out the newsletter version of this piece, because Tom has included a picture of the Greyhounds, not napping, but close to it. Thanks for listening to Tom's article, Two People on a Couch. For Sounds Profitable, that was Tom Webster's writing, and we'll see you next week for another narrated article.